Freunde, wir gucken Minecraft 2012 versus 2022 Dinge, welche damals anders waren. Yalla, das könnte actually interessant werden.
Remember when you could hit Enderman with an arrow? Or when lava blocks
Das ging?
were attainable without a bucket? And these are
weiß
51
ich actually
Minecraft
noch.
things that have changed since 2012.
Boah, es haben sich so viele Sachen verändert, das wird ein geiles Video, ich hab Bock.
Obsidian back in 2012. Since the system to make this was just using a standard cobblestone generator and then placing a piece of redstone dust where the cobblestone would form. And there you go.
Hä, und dann kam immer Obsidian? Wie dumm.
Infinite obsidian. Though understandably this got patched out in 1.8. But infinite
Erst in der 1.8 wurde das rausgepatcht? Hä?
obsidian is still possible. You're just gonna need a wither and a whole bunch of nether portals. Here's how you get water
das
in the
dumm?
nether. See, back in Java version 1.2 or
Boah, diese Lava-Textur, ne? Boah, geil.
older, it was possible that if you put ice in the nether, it would melt and then turn into a water source block, which was fixed in 1.3, but we would eventually get water in the nether once again through this snapshot with a glow like it. Though that got
dumm?
fixed too, so it's definitely something Mojang's trying to keep an eye out for. Back in the day, the end dimension used to look like a mess. And I'm not talking about the old endstone texture, but rather the obsidian pillars that would spawn there were scattered and unorganized back in the day. And really,
Boah, das war damals, Digga, ich habe ja diesen alle Versionen Speedrun probiert und da war alles so dumm, dass sie nicht im Kreis waren, sondern irgendwo.
it's hard to appreciate this one until you look at a side-by-side, because now with the ring of pillars, it looks so much better.
Ja,
and
ja,
I'm sure that
das ist echt
Sandiction's build wouldn't have looked nearly as good if this didn't get fixed. Before the update Aquatic in 1.13, any items that you threw into the water would all float down to the bottom of the ocean
Auch
floor.
so dumm. Alle Items im Wasser immer am Boden gelegen.
But nowadays, they thankfully will all float up to the surface and bob in place, which is nice in and of itself, but it's also really helpful considering that the oceans used to be so much darker. So if you lost your stuff down there, they were
Digga,
pretty much
hast du
lost
nie
to the
wieder
sands of
gefunden.
time. Now, it is true that you can't hit an Enderman with any projectiles, but that wasn't the case in 2012. Since back then, an Enderman still wouldn't be hit by an arrow, but if you used a flaming arrow, then that Enderman would take damage and catch fire as it would. Though this got fixed in 1.5, which is definitely a
dumm.
bummer for my flame bow. Villager trades used to be a ripoff.
Boah, die Villager-Trades damals waren ja geisteskrank dumm. Alter, zum Glück kam dieses Worktable-Upgrade. Digga, diese Villager waren legit scheiße.
And that's not me being cheeky, but it's quite literally true. Since in the past, there were villager trades that would ask for more than 64 emeralds per trade, which makes
Man konnte es gar nicht traden.
it completely unobtainable to the player since you
Ist das dumm?
can't offer more than 64 in a stack at a time. And in 1.8, that got limited down to the stack limit.
das dumm?
Nowadays, command blocks are indestructible, but that wasn't always the case. And in fact, when they first came out, you could place them and even mine them in survival. Though even
Ja gut, aber das finde ich nicht schlimm, die cheatest du dir ja eh.
though you were able to place and move around this block, you couldn't use it unless you were in creative mode. And after 1.6.1, you couldn't even do that. So really, it wasn't that useful of a block if you were in survival.
dumm.
Now this is a lava bucket, and this is a lava source block. So how do we get both in our inventory? Well, in the past, the give command was a lot stronger than it is
Digga, guck's dir an, einfach Lava.
today. So if you typed in /give player 10 or 11, it would give you either flowing or stationary lava blocks. And as you can probably guess,
das
this got
dumm?
removed in 1.8, which is too bad, but honestly, I don't know the point of having one of these versus just a regular lava bucket. If you played Minecraft back in the day, then you know that these boats would break all
Boah,
the
waren die scheiße. Digga, diese Boote, du bist gegen Seerose gefahren, kaputt. Und du hast ja nicht mal die Materialien bekommen, um dir wieder ein Boot zu craften, sondern Holz und Sticks. Was eine Scheiße.
time. But part of that was by design, since in 2012, you could only exit a boat or minecart if you broke the vehicle. And without the ability to left shift
So
to
dumm.
dismount, that means that we could cause certain situations where you soft lock yourself in that boat, completely unable to get out. Which is definitely the saddest way to lose your hardcore world.
GG.
That's just brutal.
Da kann man
In the
nix
past,
machen.
if you emptied a water bucket inside of a cauldron, there was no way to remove it. And the only way to get the water out of the cauldron was to
mein Gott,
break
das weiß
the
ich noch,
cauldron and
glaube.
replace it. Since using water bottles or an empty bucket couldn't do anything on it. Which makes it seem like cauldrons have been useless for a whole long time. And maybe it's true that they're more useful for lava these days than they've
Ja,
ever
das,
been for
das finde ich
water.
echt cool, dass man mit diesen Dripstones und so, das ist cool.
Using lapis lazuli to enchant seems expensive, but it used to be so much worse. Since back in the day, it would require 50 levels for a max level enchant. And
Digga, was?
folks, that's not just 50 levels to qualify, that's 50 levels for one enchantment.
So, ja, stimmt, das war ja früher so.
And even though that got bumped down to 30 levels in 1.3.1, it was eventually entirely reworked in 1.8 to where you just need 3 levels after you hit the 30 level enchant barrier. Did you know that enchanted golden apples used to be a bad thing? Yeah, oddly enough, high levels of regeneration could actually lower or remove your invincibility frames entirely, which caused this bug to make you more susceptible to damage while you had an enchanted golden apple.
Du isst einfach OP-Gap und kriegst schneller Damage, ist das geil.
And understandably so, this got fixed in 1.6.1 because that completely breaks this really powerful item. Now, although it was hard to summon the giant back in the day, there was a time where this mob actually had an AI. So when you got it into your world, it would both target and attack the player. And since it had 100 HP to its name and did 75
Ich verstehe immer noch nicht, warum der im Game ist, ne? Verstehe ich nicht.
HP on attack, it was a lot scarier than the glorified statue that we've got today. Do you remember when desert pyramids used to look like this?
Oh, so cool mit der Wolle. Das ist OG.
Well, sure enough, when they were added in, these desert pyramids would generate with wool for the colorful bits instead of the orange and blue terracotta that we're used to. And the reason being is that block wasn't in the game. It would take until 1.8 that we finally got it switched to hardened clay. And then that was later renamed to the terracotta we're used to. Nowadays, the creepers are much stronger than they used to be. Since back in the early days, a creeper's explosion would always be 43 points of damage at the strongest. But after some time, Mojang would change that to be 64 points of damage that we know today. Which, yes, does make the creeper stronger than the warden, which is crazy to think about. The As of Ender used to be a big waste of time, since they wouldn't always lead you to the closest stronghold. And what that would mean is that sometimes it might be pointing you to one that you're nowhere near to. Even
Ist das dumm.
if you're standing right above the closest one. And why did this bug happen? I'm not exactly sure, but it did get fixed in 1.6.1.
So dumm.
So thankfully we don't have to worry about it anymore. When a zombie or skeleton used to stand on a slab, it wouldn't burn into the daylight, which is terrifying to say the least, so thankfully it's got fixed
Wahrscheinlich stand der da so und hat so gedacht, nein, was?
as well in 1.8. Otherwise, I'd have to make sure that I place a lot less slabs in my base, and I'm not looking for that kind of reality check. When you stood at close range, a skeleton could not shoot you. Since in the older versions, a skeleton would try to rush forward and then shoot the player, which meant that if you cornered it into 2x2x1 area, it would try to shoot you, but all of its shots would just hit the wall behind you, meaning that none of the arrows were capable
Minecraft hatte so viele Bugs, das ist ja gestört.
Hitting the player. And unfortunately for us, the skeletons got a lot smarter in 1.9, and this doesn't work anymore. Roller coasters are a great thing, but in 2012, they were a nightmare. Since the rails, no matter which way you placed them, would always be positioned on a north by
Ey, cool, man kann einfach nur in eine Richtung eine Strecke bauen.
south axis. And the only way to fix that was to add in more rails like so, which is a nightmare to say the least. And surprisingly, this took up until 1.15, where now it finally places facing the player, which is a bit late.
Bis zu 1.15 war das so. WTF?
But still better than the alternative. Baby zombies are annoying, but they used to be so much worse. Back in 2012, they would just chase you around forever, since no matter if it was day or night, they wouldn't burn in the sunlight. And in fact, that wouldn't be added in until 1.13.
Solche scheiß Mobs.
Which was a lot of updates of having to deal with these ankle biters. And now thankfully they take after their parents and say their goodbyes when it's daytime. In the early versions of Minecraft, animal breeding was buggy to say the least. So much so that if you wanted to breed your cows or your sheep, you could do that while you were 8 blocks away, and with a fence wall in between them, which is definitely a glitch, but it kind of proves that love knows no bounds, so I think that's kind of sweet. Now, although the Wither skeleton's been in the game since 1.4, they didn't get their own spawn egg until 1.11, which is just weird to think about, since how else were you gonna get one of these things? I mean, the summon command didn't exist back then, so you're kind of out of options.
Warum gab es kein Spawn-Egg? Einfach vergessen reinzumachen, die hatten keinen Bock.
1.3, we could fit up to 60 cows in this hole, but now, thanks to entity cramming, that maxes out at 24, which is a shame when you're trying to make an efficient farm, but it's definitely a lot more humane. This is what lava looks like nowadays, and this is what it looks like in 2012.
So
It's pretty shocking, I know. And while there were a few textures that got changed in the updates
Wie das alles mal aussah.
following, it was in the 1.14 texture update that most of our textures got a huge rework when
Ey, aber so viel besser. Das im Gegensatz zu das. Da haben die wirklich einen guten Job gemacht.
they were done by Jappa, which makes some comparisons definitely hard to look at. And thankfully Netherrack looks like this instead of this mess.
Ja, das war
As
so
we know
eklig.
today, TNT has a 100% drop rate, which makes it indispensable for mining resources with a tunnel bore like so.
Ja, das
But
war
that only
damals
got
nicht so.
updated in 1.14.
Ja.
And back in 2012, you would have to mine out everything by hand or risk losing a good amount of your resources if you used a TNT block like so.
So
With this
dumm.
one bucket,
Obwohl
you
eigentlich
can
smart.
decimate this ocean. Let me show you how.
Mein Gott, wie das aussah damals.
Amount of your
Das Wasser.
resources if you used a TNT block like so. With this one bucket, we can
Guckt euch mal das an. Digga, das war früher die Hölle, diese Wasserströme.
decimate this ocean. Let me show you how. See, back in 2012, water needed a solid block below it to generate an infinite water source. Meaning if we just grab a water bucket like so, this whole ocean will be completely washed out. And you can understand why they'd fix that in 1.5. When pistons were first added in, they had a lot more errors about them. And one of the reasons this would happen is that it would only take one redstone tick to activate them, meaning with a fast enough clock, you could glitch them out like so. But later on, Mojang would double the amount of time that it would take them to extend, but they could still retract instantly. Did you know that the squids used to be stronger? Well, sure enough, if you would get one beached on land, in the past, they wouldn't suffocate. And in fact, they weren't given the ability to do so until the 1.4.4 release, proving that even in the past, Mojang barely cared about this pointless mob. 10 years ago, stairs used to be so much more annoying, since if you even went up them a little, it would force you to walk all the way up the stair. And it seems like Mojang noticed how annoying
Digga, wahrscheinlich haust du deine Tastatur kaputt, wenn du so Minecraft-Treppen hochgehst.
this was, because that was quickly changed, though not until the update 1.5. So if you're playing in versions before that, I'm deeply sorry. Back in 2012, we didn't have horses or elytras, so that meant that running was the best way to get around. But even then, it wasn't a perfect system, because back then we had to double tap the walk key to actually
Doppel-W. Böse.
sprint, and we wouldn't get a dedicated sprint button until that was added in the game in 1.7.2. You're probably familiar with this command to turn off fire ticks so that fires don't generate anymore. And while that does work, back in the day it was a little wonky, since do fire tick would allow for lightning to still
Was hat der denn da in der Hand?
generate fires, meaning if you had enough time in a world, almost every single block would have a netherrack effect, not letting fire spread, but also not getting rid of it.
Heavy random.
Before we got the update Aquatic in 1.13, the ocean biome looked
So ein gutes Update, dieses Aquatic-Ding da, dieses Aqua-Update.
extremely dark. And in fact, even if you placed glowstone down there, that would only light up about 5 blocks
das war so schlimm früher. Du hast unten einfach nichts gesehen.
around it. But nowadays, we've got things like sea lanterns and coral reefs to finally light up the abyss, which is nice, but that update also added in the drowned mobs, so you get what you get, I guess. As it is, it's pretty tough to get a beacon to work in the nether, since you've got to clear out all of the netherrack above it. But in the past, it was even worse, since back then, the beacon beam wouldn't even go through the bedrock. So to even get it to work, you'd have to remove the unbreakable block from up top. And thankfully that was corrected in 1.8.2, so you don't have to rely on a glitch to make this happen.
Ja, aber eigentlich fühl ich das nicht, dass ein Beacon im Nether funktioniert. Weil der muss ja zum Himmel dingsen quasi. Fühle ich actually nicht, dass der im Nether geht.
In the past, we could only place chests like this, and that was it, since there was no way to place a third chest next to a double chest. Or rather, you could, but you'd have to use an alternating pattern of trapped chests and regular chests.
Das war früher so, dass man nicht einzelne Chests nebeneinander setzen konnte.
That was just a lot of hassle.
Das ist auch relativ spät geaddet worden.
So thankfully, we got this restriction removed in 1.13,
Ja,
letting us place
1.13 erst.
as many chests as we want right next to each other, which is a nice fix, but I'm still hoping for the day that we get to place different wood types of chests
Boah, nee, das finde ich, sieht richtig scheiße aus. Die Standard-Minecraft-Chest muss bleiben.
right next to each other. That'll be especially cool. Not only were the oceans boring back in the past, but they also used to be way too big. Since back
Ja, ey, Digga, die Ozeane früher waren so riesig.
in the day, you could travel for thousands of blocks and not come across any side of
Und dann hattest du auch noch dieses Scheißboot von früher.
mainland, which made it a big problem if you happened to spawn in a survival island like so, which is why this got changed in
Und dann konntest du auch nicht normal schwimmen, sondern nur dieses früher Schwimmen. Digga, tot.
1.7.2 so that the ocean sizes were limited. Before the 1.8 update, we were able to use soul sand and other blocks that were slightly smaller than a full block hitbox to make these one-way doorways. Since if you walk through the archway like so, you could exit, but you couldn't come back because you would just be hitting your head on that top block. I mean, I guess you could always break the block, but in theory, it was a one-way doorway. It's funny to think that back in 2012, redstone looked entirely different. And the kind of redstone doors that we could build looked a lot more like this than the kind of monstrosities that we can build today. And I'm sure you could ask Mumbo Jumbo, as soon as that 1.5 update came out, that was definitely a blessing for the community. What's the difference between this desert well and this one? Well, in the past, the desert wells that you would find inside of desert villages had a bottom made out of cobblestone instead of sandstone. But in 1.11, that was changed so that it was more thematically consistent. Back in the day, golden apples used to be ridiculous.
Boah, geil, als man die noch so craften konnte. Und OP-Goldäpfel mit Goldblöcken. Geil.
Cheap. And to get one of the basic ones, you only needed to use 8 gold nuggets instead of the 8 ingots that we use today. Though I guess nowadays they give us the absorption hearts, so maybe it is worth paying a little extra.
Sure.
And honestly, I'll save my golden nuggets for crafting golden carrots anyway. Those seem to be more useful. If you play on a PvP legacy server, you're definitely familiar with this one. Since back in 2012, we could PvP by spam clicking, but with 1.9, we got a huge overhaul to that system. And
Digga, dieses 1.9 Combat Update wurde so gehatet, geisteskrank.
now we've got cooldown, shields,
Aber
the
so
whole
viel
works.
besser.
Bone meal's a great thing, but it used to be so much better. Since in the past, you could immediately push a crop to its final stage, instead of getting
so
a
OP.
random buff like we do today. Which made it a lot more hilarious to spam trees on your friend's lawn, but I get why it was fixed. It definitely was overpowered. When we first started using them, ender pearls did not have a cooldown to them, so you could throw them continuously,
Oh mein Gott, Digga, diese Zeit, wo du Enderperlen durchthrowen konntest.
which usually
Geil. Hallo Jan.
Resulted in taking a lot of damage. But if you had feather falling boots, it was a fun way to get yourself out of trouble and right back to the action. Completely transformative version of PvP. Though in 1.9 it was changed so that they had a cooldown and that you could use them in creative mode.
Ja,
which I guess is a trade-off. Now back in 2012 we did have ice and we did have boats, but we wouldn't have ice highways until 1.9. And the reason was because back in 2012 the boat would move as slow on ice as
Boot
it did on
damals war
land.
so
So all you
scheiße.
get from building yourself an ice highway was a waste of time to use an even greater waste of time on. Back in 2012, if you ended up going past 30 million blocks in either the X or Z direction, you'd start to run into these phantom chunks, where they'd still look like regular chunks, except once you went through them, you'd fall right into the void when you step on it. But now in 1.19, we can get to the world border, but we can't go past 29,999,999.
Da werde ich irgendwann sein.
In the past, it was possible for the Wither to destroy its own nether star due to its last-minute detonations of Wither skulls. No joke, there were times where if you killed the Wither, it might fire off one last-minute projectile.
Ja, das weiß ich auch noch, Digga.
And then that'll break the
Das ist auch relativ spät geändert worden.
star before you actually get it, making that whole fight for naught. And thankfully, this got fixed in 1.5, where
Okay, doch nicht so spät.
it was patched so that now the skulls that spawn on death were then forced removed. Nowadays, we're all familiar with the concept of an MLG water bucket save, but back in the day, it wasn't as popular, and for good reason. See, in the past, you'd need a puddle that was 2 blocks deep to stop any kind of fall damage. And it wasn't until after 1.4.4 that we could finally do this with 1 bucket. And imagine if this didn't change. I'm sure that Dream's manhunts would look a lot different. It seems like as long as villagers have been in the game, we've been trying to exploit their spawning techniques. And in the past, that was very different to do. All we needed was a door, a room, and a roof. And you can see that design in a villager breeder like this.
Die Villager damals so dumm gewesen.
And then, as soon as we got the village and pillage up
So ein gutes Update.
in 1.14 to, quote, fix the villager breeding, then it would instead require food and appropriate beds like so. Though both are very exploitable, so maybe it wasn't all that fixed. These were how many spawn eggs we had in 2012, and this is how many spawn eggs we have in 1.19. It's a crazy comparison to look at.
Digga, es sind so viele dazu
Considering
gekommen.
the last 10 years, we've gained over 50 mobs. And in fact, 71 isn't even all the mobs in the game. There's actually 79 of them that are accessible in the current version, making that discrepancy even bigger. In the past, we've sung the praises of using a boat to negate any fall damage that you might take in the nether. But there's a reason we didn't tell you to do this back in 2012.
Hat man da Damage bekommen?
For one, the channel didn't exist, but also, back then, if you were in a boat, you would still take all of the fall damage
Digga, die Boote damals so schlecht.
that you take from a fall. And it wasn't until 1.7.2 that this finally got fixed, and our boat MLG started to work out a bit better. We're all familiar with this nether portal design. It's iconic for sure, but back in the day, it was so iconic, it was the only one you could make. But luckily, as of
Stimmt, das ging mit den Ecken damals nicht, ne?
1.7.2, we've now had the option to give them different
Oder? Ach so, ja, nee, der meint das.
width and height than the standard
Das ist auch cool, dass man so große bauen kann.
4x5 that we were used to. And if you're in Bedrock Edition, you can get a whole lot more creative for the designs you make.
Das ist halt krass, dass es in eine Bedrock geht, ne?
Just make sure you build all of them without corners, otherwise you're wasting obsidian. When it was first added in, the Wither was actually much easier to fight, since if you were to catch the Wither inside of a
Oh mein Gott, als ob man den in Minecart stecken konnte früher.
hard as it was charging up, you could interfere with its startup. It would only have as much health as it had before it went into the minecart. So if you did this correctly, you could end up fighting a Wither that only had 1/3 of its health. But that bug would get fixed in 1.5, which is unfortunate, but maybe don't tell Mojang about this even easier way to kill the Wither. We'll just keep that between us. And with that, folks, YouTube thinks that you might like this video. So see if they're right and have a good one.
So ein gutes Video, das ist krass, wie viel sich verändert hat, ne? Und wie viel anders war. Das ist cool. Gutes Video.